Okay, my guess is I'm going to be able to get through most of this, but the rest of it I'm going to have to put online for you. So here we go, World War I and after. The Indian troops, just like many of the African troops, fought in World War I as British soldiers, right along next to their brethren, or I guess they weren't really brethren, they were more or less colonies or soldiers that were part of the British Empire. So they fought along with them. They actually did fight in Europe. There wasn't any fighting going on in India like there was in Africa. So most of the troops were put on boats, shipped over to Europe, and then fought along the British troops, the French troops, those on the Allied powers. Because of that, the British put India under military restrictions. So they really locked things down because most of the soldiers and the officers were in Europe. They weren't in India to keep the peace. Those that were in India keeping the peace were lower staff officers. So many of the civil liberties and some of the security and all those other things were taken away from the Indian citizens. They were hoping at the end, because they were treated like citizens, and when I mean that, I mean more like soldier citizens. They were treated as equals in the military. So upon returning, many of the Indians assumed that they would get that independence for fighting and helping to keep Great Britain free. But we all know what happens when you assume things, right? Your parents have done that to you. They've said, well, maybe, or I'll think about it, or we'll see. And you're like, yes. And then it all comes down, and you say, remember when you said? And they went, I never said I would. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, dude, dang. Right? Politicians are great about that. They say something in a roundabout way, but they never say it exactly. So when somebody says, well, you said you would do that. No, I never said I would. I said I would try, but I never said I would, or something along that line. After the war, the British failed to lift those restrictions and restore their civil liberties. Well, we were going to, but we're not. It's kind of like me saying, I'm going to make sure everybody has to do X, Y, and Z every single day, blah, 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 blah. And then in a couple weeks, we'll lift that ban. And like, no eating lunch in here whatsoever. And then you're like, yes, a couple weeks. And then I'm like, oh yeah, by the way, no. But you said, yeah, well, I changed my mind too. And I didn't say it was going to be forever. I just said no. So many of the Indians obviously felt betrayed. This increases their support for nationalism. They start banding together. We're Indians, we're not British citizens. We're not treated like British citizens. So demonstrations start increasing more and more and more. Protests, more and more and more and more. Just a little picture of the Indian troops in British trenches on the Western Front in World War I. Okay? Taken away from their homes. Many of them have never been out of India before, and now they're stuck in France in a really deep, muddy, gross pit, being shot at. For what? For their freedom? No. Do they get anything if they win? They get to stay in control of, nothing. But we get to continue to be in control by Great Britain. Yay, us. In 1919, even after the war had ended, Great Britain's still in control. They're holding political protests. Hey, Great Britain promised. They said we probably should, and they're not. Excuse me one moment. Hello? Hello? Yep. Catherine, would you go get DP? Yeah. Okay. So they were holding political protests against the British rule in Amritsar. If you remember earlier with our religion unit, and I showed you this, and I said, hey, this is going to be really important. Remember this? Now's the time to remember this. So this is the shrine, the golden part in the middle. The Amritsar is all this white building back here as well, and it actually goes back and behind. And behind this, there's like a big open area. But it's all walled in, and there's just kind of an open middle place. Does that make sense? So it's a huge complex with a great big huge open area in the middle. Okay, this is the golden place is just kind of the shrine, the small piece of a bigger part. So on April 18th or 13th, 1919, you could quick do the math, and you go, wait, that's today, but many years ago. How ironic is that? And yesterday was the assassination of Lincoln. And you're going to find out throughout history, April's a really bad month. A lot of really bad things happen in April. And some of you are going, but I was born in April. It has nothing to do with your birthdays. A lot of bad events happen in April. It's just the way it goes. I don't know what it is, but it's just bad news all the way around. But April 13th, 1919, Indians staged a peaceful protest against the British rule. British troops walked in, closed off the exits, and opened fire in the crowd, killing several hundred. Thousands were injured and or killed. The tragedy convinced many of those middle-of-the-road
England is so powerful. Its army and its navy, all its modern weapons. But when a great power like that strikes defenseless people, it shows its brutality, its own weakness, especially when those people do not strike back. Begs us to take the course of non-violence. But if we riot, if we fight back, we become the vandals and they become the law. If we bear their blows, they are the vandals. God and his law are on earth. We must have the courage to take their anger.
Cavalry Major. visual warning, sir.
They've had their warning. No meetings.
Is it correct that you ordered your troops to fire at the thickest part of the crowd?
That is so.
$1,516 casualties with 1,650 bullets.
My intention was to inflict a lesson that would have an impact throughout all India.
General, had you been able to take in the armored car, would you have opened fire with the machine gun?
I think probably yes.
General, did you realize there were children and women in the crowd?
I did.
But that was irrelevant to the point you were making.
That is correct.
Could I ask you what provision you made for the wounded?
I was ready to help any who applied.
General, how does a child shot with a .303 Lee Enfield?
As you can see, things in India were not going well for the Indians and even Great Britain, because they knew that after this massacre, the nation itself would probably try and rise, and those people in India were going to have a lot more ammunition, if you will, to fight back against Great Britain. Great Britain had to do a lot of damage control and tightened up the reins even more on India to keep people in line, and we're going to take a look at what that looks like a little bit later on. But for the most part, you can see that that whole sense of nationalism begins with this massacre of Amritsar. Before, it was just protests and gatherings and those type of things before. Now it becomes even more of an issue. At the same time, Japan, right after World War I, becomes an idealistic with more imperialism. They helped the Allies defeat Germany and China, and in doing so, the victors get the spoils of war. And one of those spoils was the Shandong province of China, which was currently controlled, or at least the ports were controlled, by Germany. They also got some of the other islands in the archipelagos in the Pacific Ocean, and that gives them a taste of imperialistic
ideas and spreading their boundaries instead of being just a small tiny island that's ignored by most of the world. During World War I, they were very impressed with the military strength and the industrialization of many of those Western countries. Their goal was to emulate the West or become like the Western countries. They wanted to modernize their nation, and this brought a greater sense of nationalism because of that. As you can see on this map, Japan was very small to begin with, island-wise, and after World War I, they started to begin to spread through, and starting in China and moving forward. And we'll take a look at what happens and how all those things happen with what's going on. So how did they actually create this empire? How did they become imperialistic? Their first job was to abolish feudalism. Feudalism, if you remember, is that old way of the king, queens, their personnel or the royal personnel, their royal family, and then the hierarchy going lower and lower and lower and lower into the servants or the serfs or the peasants. And they restored the power of the emperor, and this is the establishing of the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji was a few people in charge of basically changing the entire country and modernizing the Japanese culture. A few people making decisions for everybody, and considered almost communistic, as a few made a change for everyone. They adopted a new calendar, Western clothing, the Army, Navy were updated and improved, and they got rid of those samurai values and those samurai warriors, which were a long-standing piece of the Japanese culture. And because of that, they were able to become, within 30 years, establish themselves as a world power. They were equal on all playing fields, economically, militarily, industrially. However, they were treated unequally. They were treated unequally because they were not of a European background. They weren't of the European race. And because of this unequal treaties and racism, it leaves a kind of a sour taste in the Japanese mouths. They wanted a racial equity clause. And this is one of the things that starts to tip the Japanese away from the Western culture and to fight back against it, is this racial equity clause in the League of Nations, which was to become the United Nations later on, at least after World War II. It was rejected by most of the Western cultures and the Western countries of the world. This arrogance and racial discrimination continued toward the Japanese for a couple of years, and even in 1924, Congress banned immigrants from Japan. So these are just some of the things that Japan is dealing with on a social and racial issue with the rest of the world. They can't get over, or they can't get the West to get over the fact that they are at least close to, if not equal at the same time. And it's just one of those things that becomes a sticking point for them. And it's just one of, and we'll look at many more of these, but just one of those small pieces that leads to Pearl Harbor.